Illinois State Library. It's a few minutes before 11. I am pleased to have so many people here today. This session is being recorded and will be hosted on the ICPN website. If you have logged in and have not associated which institution you are from, please do that now. Elizabeth, Josh, Guest, Kelly, Kim, Laura, Mary Lynn's from the Morton Public Library. Please log in with your name and what institution you are from, and if you have more than one guest that is with you today. That'll give us an accurate count. Thank you, Pat. Hello, Elizabeth Hetty from Prairie Skies. At any time during this webinar, if you do have a question, you can go ahead and text in. Please stand by. We'll be starting here in a minute. Change the recording stuff. Yeah. That's fine. Okay. Alrighty. Oops. Okay. Just change over this. Okay, here we go. Okay. Welcome to today's webinar on the care of natural history materials. My name is Bonnie Parr, and I am the Historical Documents Conservator of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum here in Springfield, Illinois. I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar. Our special thanks goes to the Illinois State Library for hosting our webinar, and especially to Debbie Eggert for providing our technical support today. This program would not be possible without the support of the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the steering committee members of the Illinois Collections Preservation Network. Before we get into our preservation topic today, I'd like to share with you a brief history of the Illinois Collections Preservation Network, or the ICPN. In 2009, a group of preservation professionals from several Illinois libraries, museums, historical societies, and other related cultural institutions received an IMLS Connecting to Collections Planning Grant. During the course of this one-year grant, these partners led discussions across the state to identify the preservation needs of collecting institutions. A survey of around 300 institutions revealed that there is a great demand for preservation training and support. This survey information was used to write a statewide preservation plan, form the ICPN, and apply for an IMLS Connecting to Collections implementation grant. In 2011, Illinois was awarded the implementation grant, one of only 6 states to do so. Today's webinar is one result of that grant. You can find much more information on our website, including a list of grant partners and additional programming. Our website address is shown on the screen. It is icpn.museum.state www.il.us. ICPN programming is free to participants and includes an in-person disaster recovery workshops covering the topics of disaster preparation, recovery, and response, and includes a hands-on salvage exercise of wet collection materials. Fire recovery workshops in which participants will recover and salvage burn materials. A toolkit which includes data loggers, museum vacuums, and a few other useful tools to assist in monitoring and maintaining storage environments. This toolkit is available to cultural institutions in Illinois to borrow at no charge. Another programming event is the webinar series on preservation topics such as this one today. Again, for those who have signed in, we request that you please type in your name and institution in the chat box at the lower right corner of your screen. Also during this program, please feel free to type in your questions, and I will relay them to Bronwyn Eves, our presenter, for discussion during or following her talk. Now I have the great pleasure to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Bronwyn Eves. She's an objects conservator in private practice here in Springfield, Illinois. She worked as a conservator at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago and also has worked on the natural history collections at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield. Currently, she is project manager of the ICPN. Now I will turn over the mic and the camera to Bronwyn. Good morning.
Thank you, Bonnie, and good morning. Good morning to everyone who's joined us today. When I was asked to present on this topic, I began gathering information on collections care talked aimed at large natural history collections based on the title of the topic. But as I was preparing, I was watching the ICPN network grow, and it has grown to over 200 members in the last several months. And a lot of these members are small museums, libraries, and historical societies, and you all have become the backbone of the ICPN. One of the great strengths of our program is our cross-disciplinary outreach to museums, libraries, and historical societies. So what I am presenting today is some information about collections care on large natural history collections, and there certainly are a lot of hurdles in dealing with those collections, but I also am presenting information that I hope is useful for libraries and historical societies that might have small collections of natural history materials or even just a few items. As Bonnie mentioned, please don't hesitate to type in questions you might have on a particular item in your collection, and hopefully we can answer it today or get back to you with more information. Natural history museums have, excuse me, didn't advance my slides here. Natural history museums often have large and diverse collections. In fact, this is one of the biggest preservation hurdles for these types of collections, size and range of materials. Many natural history museums have conservation staff or well-trained collections manager, but when natural history materials are found in libraries and historical societies and even art museums as supplementary material, the staff might not be prepared to deal with these materials. Things like taxidermy specimens, fluid preserved materials, and minerals often show up in small amounts in these institutions. If you're lucky enough to have preservation staff, they probably don't have training in the care of taxidermy mounts. So today we'll look at some of the challenges to caring for these materials. And what I hope to inspire you to do is look around your collections. Can you identify every material that's in your collection? On exhibit, in storage areas, in your education materials. This is the absolute first step in knowing how to care for your collections, is knowing what you have. Our first webinar a few weeks ago was Preservation Tactics on a Shoestring Budget. It was very well received by our audience, and I hope you were able to join us a few weeks ago for that. Your feedback showed that you liked the live camera, so here we are live today, and that you liked the preservation tips. So today I'd like to build on that topic and offer some more tips that you can use and solutions to problems. And if you did miss our last session, I will remind you that it's archived on our website under the Events tab. As I mentioned, there are many challenges to caring for natural history collections. The material found in these museums is diverse. It can range from botanical specimens insects, bones, feathers, fluid-preserved specimens, soil samples, and minerals. The collections are generally large and research-based, meaning they have supporting materials, including journals and microscope slides. Natural history collections often contain hundreds or thousands or even millions of artifacts. This is a logistical problem, plain and simple. It would take a very large staff to care for and monitor collections of this magnitude. I have a suggestion for tackling that problem, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Large collections inevitably lead to storage problems also. There's just not enough of it. The temptation can be to crowd the aisles and fill the tops of shelves and cabinets. This obviously is not safe for the collections, but it can lead to accidents such as tripping in the aisles and overcrowded areas of storage. And this is a hazard to not only the artifacts, which we all care about and work with daily, but also to you and other people that you might have in your collections area. Another concern is overcrowding the tops of cabinets, and I recently heard a first responder talk to this topic. If you have a water suppression system, it's not going to be able to function and do its job if it's physically blocked by artifacts on top of your storage, or even just full enough that you're blocking the path of the water. I'm going to go back for a minute here to this slide. Natural history collections must be tied to their scientific research and data. The materials have been collected to document the presence of specimens in a given location and at a particular time. The physical object was collected by a scientist with the details of the collection site carefully documented. Both the object and the data must be preserved together. Although the documentation of all museum objects is important, that of natural history collections is vital to the interpretation and understanding of the specimen. The journals must be treated as objects and preserved according to museum and library standards. But additionally, the journal and specimens must be connected through a cataloging system. So if you're a library and these materials have become separated over time, recognize that they are critical to each other. They don't have to be stored together, and it's usually preferable that they are not, but they indeed do need to be linked. Care of these journals is more difficult than care of a lot of books because they come in a variety of shapes, sizes, have different bindings, have been used and abused in the field by the researcher. They've even been compared to scrapbooks, which are extremely difficult to preserve based on the presence of tape, glues, different types of printing, different types of ink, and sometimes they even have photographs. Some very basic guidelines include storing the books upright if they fully fit on a shelf, using flat storage for oversized and fragile books. And journals in poor condition might even benefit from reformatting and treating the original very uniquely and creating its own archival box and storing it that way. Because these research materials, because they are research materials, they may be requested for use by current researchers, your artifacts and your books, journals, and data. This means that all this material might be handled more frequently than, say, a fine art object. You need to have a protocol in place in your institution for how researchers can handle this material. I was speaking to a paleontologist recently who said that there is a lot of destructive analysis in that field. And so just letting a researcher at your collection know that they're going to come at it very differently. Some people might have different sampling techniques, but it's something that you need to be aware of and be on top of. We'll talk about safety of your collection in a little bit because you have the obligation to these researchers to make sure the area they use is safe and the objects they are handling are safe. Sometimes you're protecting the user from the artifact, and sometimes you're protecting the artifact from the user. If you're at a library and need advice on the care of artifacts, someone at ICPN, we can put you in touch with a library or book conservator. And if you need help with museum objects, if you're a library and that's not your area of specialty, we can put you in touch with objects conservators. Of course, the preservation needs of all these diverse material collections is different as well. However, there's some general guidelines that can help create optimal storage environment. These are the environmental guidelines, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. Generally, an environment of a temperature around 68 to 70 degrees with minimal fluctuations is optimal, and a relative humidity around 45 to 50% is recommended. These ranges can be expanded slightly, and the key is to avoid extreme temperature shifts. If you are a historical society that closes down certain times of the year, those, and accordingly all HVAC systems are shut down, those rapid and extreme fluctuations are what we're more concerned about and should be avoided. Also, not changing settings at nights and weekends, and for prolonged holiday closures, those can have a detrimental effect as well. The ideal environment for preservation of natural history collections can be difficult to contain, and we do understand that. And that's why we recommend that you focus on gradual shifts and work to obtain those ideals. As I mentioned, a controlled storage environment can greatly increase the life of collections, and I highly recommend this as a short-term goal for all collecting institutions. It's a complicated and sometimes expensive task, but I encourage you to consult a professional building engineer to assess your storage needs and provide recommendations for some low-tech solutions, from adding a humidifier or dehumidifier all the way up to high-tech solutions, including a new or updated HVAC system. There will always be discussions around budget, what the building needs, and what the collections needs, but by discussing the issues on all different scales, there are many compromises that can be reached that ultimately better the collection storage. Whether you have high-tech or low-tech environmental controls, it's important to monitor your collections areas. This information will give you definitive evidence when your system is working and where it needs tweaking. Even if you know you have a less than ideal situation, consider monitoring it anyway. This information, gathered over a year or more, can be used for fundraising, informing your board, and sharing with the building engineer when you do get to the point of needing a new system. As Bonnie mentioned, the ICPN has monitoring equipment that ICPN members can borrow for free. One of the things you can borrow is this data logger, and I brought one to show you today. Find the camera, because if you're not familiar with them, I wanted to emphasize how small, compact, and easy to use that they are. This is one of several that we have that you can borrow, and are happy to send you as many as you need to use for a certain period of time. It records every 5 minutes relative humidity and temperature in the area. At 30 minutes, it averages these points, these readings, and creates a point on your data that then is retrieved by this USB port, and just by using a flash stick inserted into that USB port, that information is transferred to your computer, where supporting software can give you charts, diagrams. You can manipulate the information in many different ways. So please contact us if that's something that you think your institution could benefit from. Another environmental concern is light and safe and clean storage. These are both critical. All organic materials are deteriorated by light and pests, and some inorganic material as well. It is critical to long-term preservation to store collections away from light, preferably in cabinets, but if that's not available in your institution, remember to turn out lights when you're not in the room. Try not to do long-term work in that room if it can be avoided. Some simple ways to reduce the light exposure to your collections. If you have open shelving and you do have a lot of work constantly in the room, you might consider covering the shelves with unbleached cotton muslin. Old sheets are even an option. Sometimes using a poly cotton blend of the sheets is going to prevent as much moisture uptake. The cotton sheets are going to readily absorb and desorb the moisture in the room, but polycotton blend old sheets are great use, a great material for that use. One thing that you do want to be careful of, once you put up those sheets and you've created that nice dark area in your storage room, that's very inviting to pests. So you want to always maintain maintenance in your storage areas. You want to use sticky traps. They are a wonderful way to know what's going on in your collection. I hope that you don't find one like is on the screen there, but if you do have a problem, you're going to see it on your sticky trap. And if you catch something and you cannot identify it, there is a wonderful resource. It's a website, www.museumpests.net. You can sign up to be on their listserv. It's a very active listserv, and you will probably see postings daily on someone at an institution asking to identify an insect. Is it harmless? Is it, should I be worried about it in my collection? And you can do the same. Just send in an image of what you've caught, and there are all kinds of experts logged on to that listserv, and you'll get a pretty quick response. It's a very active listserv. Within your storeroom, it's important to use high-quality archival storage materials. Again, something that I'm sure you've all heard before. Many wool, silk, leather, and fur, for example, organic materials, require unbuffered storage materials. And I wanted to bring this up today because several of us are using archival boxes and materials, and I have one to show you today. Probably not unlike things you haven't seen before, but your standard blue gray board archival boxes. These are buffered, and I'm not sure that a lot of people are aware of that, but that is great in a lot of instances when you do require buffered storage materials. But keep that in mind if you are storing something that should be unbuffered in an unbuffered environment. And the way you can deal with that, they're great boxes, they're really good materials to have in your storeroom. Just make sure and line it with a unbuffered tissue paper. And the tissue paper is helpful in storing a lot of these materials anyway. Some collections are not going to be bothered by storage materials, but I think it's a good habit to be in, a protocol. Your minerals, for example, acidic, non-acidic materials, it's not going to matter too much. But if you have a shell collection and you have acidic materials, that collection can be decimated over time by something called Bind's disease, where the acidic materials are released from the storage containers. It reacts with humidity in the air and the calcium carbonate from the shell, and it leaches that out and forms salts, and the salts go in and out of solution as humidity changes, and it can lead to small problems like salts on your surface of your material to completely lost collections. So I'm just emphasizing storage materials again today. Like I said, these are things that you've probably heard before, but doesn't hurt to be reminded.
That's a question.
Yes, Bonnie said there's a question here.
Okay. Can you use sheets of ethafoam instead of unbuffered tissue to counteract buffered boxes?
Yes, that would be a good solution too. What you're doing is minimizing or preventing the contact between the buffered material and your artifacts. So I think that would be a good solution. Sometimes in these large collections it comes down to cost of materials and time of working with them. Sometimes ethafoam can be, it's a great material, but you know, cutting and shaping and getting it to fit just right can take some time.
Can you explain what ethafoam is?
Ethafoam is an inert packing material used in many storage collections. It's a closed-cell polyethylene material. It comes in different sizes, different thicknesses, and can be very useful for padding out drawers, minimizing vibrations in shipping containers. It's used. Are we caught up on questions, Bonnie?
We are.
Okay. I'm going to talk about something that I've recently been thinking a lot about. I recently heard a talk at AAM titled, "Curatorial Volunteers, Oh My Goodness, Get Over It." And I think the same thing could be said about conservation volunteers. To put it mildly, there are just too many artifacts in our collective collections for current staffing to care for. I would like to encourage you today to initiate an active volunteer group at your institution. The session that I attended was presented by the South Dakota Art Museum, but I thought the material could be applicable to any large collection, especially natural history ones. I even came away from the session thinking that I would recommend the use of volunteers at all sized institutions. Some of the current concerns I know you're sitting there thinking about using volunteers in your collections might be wondering how to identify the volunteers you would even want handling your collections, not knowing exactly how to train them, and not thinking you have enough time to have them in your building to do the training. It's just not worth it, is what a lot of people end up coming away from volunteer experiences with. So to answer some of those questions, I'll share some information that was presented in that session I attended. You're going to hand select your volunteers. You're going to ask them their hobbies, if they've done things like sewing, cake decorating, perhaps even an artist or someone who's retired in their former career. They had good hand skills. They probably are going to be a good candidate. You can do plenty of training with them and retraining throughout the program as it goes on. You'll be able to see the type of work that they can do, and it might take a little bit of tweaking here and there. What the South Dakota Art Museum did was hire a contract conservator. They did not have a conservator on staff, as a lot of institutions do not. The conservator assessed the collection prior to the volunteers and worked with the curator to design a program that volunteers would be capable of. And in their case, they were measuring artifacts, recording them, creating images and files that hadn't been created in the accession records, and even getting more involved in collections storage and rehousing of artifacts once they got more familiar with working with the collections. So the conservator spent a few days with them in the institution, going over common problems they might encounter, and even taught them some things to look for, how to know when the problem was too big to handle and they might need to consult a conservator, and then taught them problem solving for the different problems they might encounter. The curator of this institution estimated that she spends about 4 hours a week to prep for the volunteers coming and to work with them. She works side by side with them. And I know you're thinking 4 hours, how do I carve out that? This might help you be able to find that time. At the end of a year, she estimated, or she figured, that she had the equivalent of 1 full-time employee work from all these volunteers, and it was a fairly small group. The museum was committed to the volunteers. They enlisted outside expertise to get the project funded and started, and they identified the willing and capable volunteers in their area. The storage areas were improved at the end of the project, and the volunteers now have a vested interest in your institution and your programming as well. They're going to leave their volunteer shift and go out and talk to their friends, their family. They're going to probably come to your events more regularly, and you're going to benefit in your collections area as well. So I encourage you to talk to your administration, and if you don't already have a program like this started, I think it's a great use of volunteers. I would also mention here that conservation graduate programs require summer as well as year-long internships during their training. Again, if you don't have a conservator, it might be a program that you could work with a conservator to help design something that these students could come in and do. And students are up on all the current trends. They go back to their institutions. They have all the resources of their professors and classmates. So I think using conservation grad students is a great way to get some work done in your collections too. I want to talk for a little bit about hazards in your collection. I talked before about identifying what you have in your collection, and if you're bringing in new volunteers, you need to be acutely aware of hazards that exist in your collections. This is true also for your staff and your visitors if you have potentially hazardous materials in public spaces. If you have unknown or uncontrolled risk in your collection, meaning you don't know, you can't answer that question of what's on that shelf, those materials are inaccessible for research and display. They just simply cannot be used. You cannot put them in front of the public, and you cannot have a researcher handling them. You should use safe work practices to minimize your risk. These are policies that you should have for using your collections and working in collections areas. The basics of wearing the appropriate gloves, not eating and drinking around collections. Pretty basic, but it doesn't hurt to be reminded and to remind staff of these things. These policies get put in place and put on a shelf a lot of times. The senior staff should lead by example. And we should ask ourselves, why do some of these collections look so good after 100 or hundreds of years? Possibly the use of lots of preservatives that we don't necessarily want to subject ourselves to.
Would you like to answer a question?
Sure.
Okay, this is what's the best way to handle taxidermy specimens that you know contain arsenics?
Oh, thank you, Kelly. We're going to get to that in a little bit. I can say that so you said, your question says you know that it contains arsenic. There are a few options. Once you've identified the arsenic, they're safe to have in your collections. I would recommend, if you don't need them in your collections, to deaccession them, and that opens up lots of cans of worms, because deaccessioning is not something that's done lightly, and if it's contaminated, you can't just throw it in the garbage. So my first recommendation, if you're a small historical society or it's not relevant to your mission, something doesn't fit in your collection, but you happen to have just acquired it over the years, try to get rid of it. And there are waste disposal companies that will get rid of hazardous materials. It's probably expensive, but I would look into that. Second suggestion would be to handle it safely with personal protective equipment. Always wear gloves, an apron in the area when you're handling it, and a respirator that's fitted with HEPA particulate cartridges. And another option is to bag these items. I know some of them can be quite large. If it's something fairly small, place it in a bag, seal it up, label it. I think if it's in a bag or if it's not in a bag, it needs to be labeled. If you are walking into a storeroom that has lots of arsenic-laced material, then you need to have that door notified, or labeled, I'm sorry, that you need to let people know coming into the area what they're dealing with. Routine maintenance is important. You should be using a vacuum with a HEPA filter, and that's HEPA, and that is going to trap the arsenic inside your vacuum and not blow it around the rest of the room. But taxidermy specimens can be loaded with arsenic, as your question implies. So say you vacuum it, you feel like it's good to go. It probably isn't. Over time, more arsenic is going to come out. So I would just emphasize regular routine maintenance and personal protective equipment.
Okay, there's another question that came up. If you want to continue answering it, it is, what is the best way to store small radioactive minerals? And asking whether lead-lined photography film bags are okay.
They are. I talked to a geologist about this question recently, and his response was that they are generally not a problem in collections, or not that often don't occur that often in collections. But when they do, the risk of that you're what am I trying to say? What you are exposing yourself to is the dust. So as they break down, it's the radioactive dust. Inhalation and ingestion are the ways that hazard is going to affect you. And so bagging it, I would recommend. I think the lead-lined photography film bags are a good solution. But I also think just a standard museum polyethylene bag is going to be a step to start if you do have those in your collection. We caught up on questions here, Bonnie?
Yes, we are.
Okay. I've jumped ahead a little bit here, so bear with me as I get myself back on track. Just like identifying the materials you have in your collection, you need to identify your hazards. And if you're affiliated with a university, or there's a university in your area, the chemistry department is going to be a good friend of yours. They have students who are interested in projects, and when you go to a chemistry department and say you're a museum and you have these materials you'd like identified, they are usually very eager to jump on board and can get you a lot of student help and analysis of a lot of what you might have. Someone also recently suggested that you could use a local pharmacist. If you have a collection of, say, old medicine bottles and they have antiquated names and labels on them, they might be able to help you figure out what you have. But I'm also here today to give you some suggestion for low-tech tools. Look at the objects in your collections. We're all trained in looking at objects, and we look at them more closely than most anyone else. We interact with them almost daily. Really look at your collections closely. Arsenic is going to be visible as a white powder on your collections. Not every white powder is going to be arsenic, but until I know that it's not arsenic, I would probably treat it like it is. Arsenic shows up on ethnographic collections, on wood. Obviously, it was used in making taxidermy mounts. Up until 1980, it's been documented, but it was also spread among ethnographic collections, wool, fur, and wood as a preservative. So really look at your collections. Another thing I think that isn't done enough is reading old accession records. These, if they were complete, they hold a lot of information. What collections were treated, what donors did, sometimes that information is in there. But a lot of your collections you were just not going to know. So again, I would go cautiously onto things that you don't know about. Chemicals in your collection can come from things like old medicine bottles I mentioned, old first aid kits. Picric acid is in historic first aid kits, and if it was used as an analgesic, and over time it becomes a contact explosive. So what you might think is just a benign component of a kit might be very disastrous. Plastics in collections are hazards, not so much to you, but to themselves and to the artifacts around them. As plastics age, and we're all going to be seeing this more and more in our collections, the materials break down, the plasticizers leach out, and you can end up with some gooey messes. There's a contemporary art museum, a contemporary collection, and they have a lot of plastics, obviously, and on things that have cords, they actually cut off those cords. And the collections manager I talked to thought that served two purposes. It kept the curators from wanting her to plug these things in and use them all the time, which wasn't appropriate. And it also kept those plastic materials from becoming big gooey messes in collection storage.
There's one question about it. What about mothballs?
Mothballs are not recommended anymore. They're still sold, I believe, for use in home collections. They are found to not really work that well, and they also are carcinogenic. So if you do have them in your collections, you want to remove them. The better approach, again, would be the integrated pest management system, which I talked about. I don't think I mentioned it, but it's what the main component is the sticky trap. So it's monitoring your areas. If you have moths, you are most likely going to collect them on a sticky trap. And so then you'll know that you have them, and keeping those materials that are susceptible to moth damage in bags is a way to minimize the damage in the collections. But mothballs are not as good as we used to think they were. And that's what happens with a lot of these things over time. We don't realize they're hazards when they're introduced into the collections. Some materials can be inherently dangerous, like some of these things I've mentioned, or they can have had the dangers added to them, such as specimens treated with arsenic or arrows in your collection that might be poison-tipped. Some materials are hazardous all the time, and some materials are hazardous as they age, like I mentioned, the picric acid, and also powdery metal pigments, heavy metal pigments like cadmium. Those are going to be inhalation problems and hazards. If I had a lead artifact in my collection, I would wear gloves with it. I would handle it. That's about the level of protection I would take with it and be comfortable leaving it on a shelf. If that specimen started powdering, flaking, the lead was corroding, I would want to enclose it in a box, keep that dust from being spread around the collection. That is my using your low-tech slide. Use your eyes. Look around. We see more than I think that we realize. RTK is the right to know, and I just want to spend a minute talking about this. I mentioned it earlier. Once you've identified hazards in your collection, you have the right to know. I'm sorry, your staff, your volunteers, your researchers, and anyone that's using your collections has the right to know. That means labeling drawers if you've identified arsenic, labeling doors to the outside of storerooms, as I mentioned. Everyone who comes into contact with your collection. A lot of people who've worked in museums over time become lax on personal safety. That's a decision that you're choosing to make. I don't recommend it. I don't encourage it. But if you're bringing in researchers and general public for tours, they have the right to know, and they need to be able to make those decisions for themselves. So this is going to be spelled out in a policy, hopefully, and then followed by everyone. Once you've identified the hazard, you need to weigh the risk. The risk is the degree to which the hazard affects you. And you might not be able to control the hazard in your collection. It's an integral part of your collection, but you can control the risk. I think I mentioned this when I was answering the question on arsenic. If you have arsenic-laced mounts in public areas, even if it's in a vitrine, that arsenic probably has a way of finding its way out. I might consider replacing it with a more modern mount. If the value is in the historic mount and that's not possible, then of course that's another issue. But that is something that you consider to reduce that risk to the public. Collections of old medicine bottles. Determine what's important. Is it what's inside? Is it so dried up or not really the same material inside? You can have a professional waste hauler remove the hazard waste inside, and oftentimes they will save the bottle or labels that will save any material that goes along with it and clean it out. So you've now maintained the information, the bottle, any labels, but you've gotten rid of the hazard of your collection. Of course, if that is a curatorial decision, not to be taken lightly, if that liquid is vital, then you need to, that wouldn't be a good solution. And lastly, maintaining strict housekeeping schedule. I mentioned this again earlier as well. Dusting and vacuuming is going to reduce or eliminate any hazards that are airborne in your collection storage areas. This is an impulse sealer. If you've weighed the risk and you determine there are certain materials you need to keep in your collection, there are some ways that are safer to store them than others. Laura mentioned the lead-lined bags for radioactive materials as a solution. This is an impulse sealer where you can create a bag any size you want, seal it up, and have your artifact sealed and safe that way. That will, if anything were to break, it contains the spill. You'll seal the bottles individually, store them vertically when possible, use ethafoam or another cushion material to prevent them from knocking into each other. And I think that's all I'll say on that. I talked about plastics in collections and isolating them if they do look like they're becoming a gooey mess. I have a question for everyone who's joining us today. Does anyone know what this is? If you could type in if you have any thoughts on what this is. Elizabeth is typing. Gaslight, it's not a light. Laura, fire suppression device, fire grenade, you guys got it. It's a firebomb, and they were, I don't know how commonly used, but I know they're still being found today in historic houses. They were used from 1870 to 1940, and it's been called a fire grenade, a fire bomb. It's carbon tetrachloride filled, and the way it works is the glass is designed to break when it gets to a certain temperature, and the chemical inside, aside from being a carcinogen, which is a problem, it depletes oxygen from the area to put out the fire. Okay, if nobody's in the room, if anyone happens to be in the room, that's going to be a problem. They could be all over. There are documents that show there'll be 12 to 15 of them in a house, a single house. So again, a hazardous waste disposer can get rid of the chemical inside and save the container for you. These are something to be aware of in historic homes.
Pat noted that she knows a place where they used one for a doorstop.
Oh my word. There was a time when they were filled with salt water too, which obviously wouldn't be as dangerous. I don't understand the theory how a little ball of salt water is going to be much help in a fire. But wow, I hope that they had an empty Pat. We've all heard about asbestos because it's a pretty commonly talked about mineral. A lot of people have them in their collections, but the same things hold true that you probably already know. If it's contained, there are actually collections that have jars full of asbestos. That's fine sitting on a shelf. I would like to see it labeled. I would like to see it not be opened or make it really hard so that if somebody is opening it for some analytical reason that they know what they're getting into. And if you don't need it, get rid of it. Again, reducing these things in our collection that we don't need, they've just been around over the years because of history. If you really want to dig deep into identifying hazards in your collection, I don't know a lot about this program, but I'll mention it to you here if you want to look into it further. OSHA has an on-site consultation program for small non-for-profits. I believe these programs are free. And what I was told about them is it's not to scare you, and they're not going to come in and slap all their OSHA fines on you. But when they do come in and help you out and identify these things in your collection, these problems in your areas, you do need to address them. So there probably is a follow-up. So be warned. Another question, Bonnie?
Yeah, I was asking about how can these fire bombs be emptied without breaking the very thin glass?
I would imagine they would have to break the glass. They would have to cut it open somehow. You can see the slide here on the bottom. They might have to cut the bottom off. It would be changed or altered in some way, but it could be, the remaining of it could be salvaged. And again, probably the waste haulers aren't used to dealing with museum collections, but these are the type of things that people get excited about. And if you go to, they deal with, nothing like this on a daily basis. But if you take a few minutes and show them around your institution and talk to them about the value of your collections and what's valued in this piece, I would imagine that they would be real interested in working with you. Many of us have probably heard of MSDS sheets, Material Safety Data Sheets, and they are a great way to identify hazards in your collection. A lot of us collect them. We know we have to put them in a binder on the shelf. If you take the time to read them, it will show you just how the hazards will affect you in your collection, and will give you some information on personal protective equipment to use. This website I recently found out about, and you can enter common names, you can enter chemical names, and has a great database for searching MSDS sheets. I did not have the chance to take this, but they also have a big plug on their homepage for free online lab safety training. It appeared to be geared towards teachers and students, but I think that these are places that we can always learn, or at least be reminded about a little bit of lab safety. So this is something you might suggest to curators, registrars, people in your collections that might need some gentle reminders on safety. Looking at the time, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. The ICPN has been hosting disaster preparedness workshops throughout the state, as Bonnie mentioned. We have 2 more remaining, one on June 11th in Naperville and one on July 9th in Freeport. Please contact me if you would like to attend one of these. We talk about disaster planning, writing a disaster plan, and disaster response. But at each workshop, we've also been including a first responder, and their input has just been valuable. And the attendees really come away with a lot of information from them. One thing they have all stressed is called pre-fire planning. And just like I mentioned with OSHA, they are not coming in, they want to come in your institution. They're not coming in to give you fines, tell you to move this, do that. They want to know if there is a disaster in your institution or they're responding to a fire. They want to know what they're getting into. So that goes back to hazards. If you stop them at the door, they're trying to respond to a fire in your institution, and you say, I don't know, I think there's something hazardous on shelf 2 in room 3, that's going to slow them down. If they've been at your institution, they've met with you, they've talked with you, you've told them exactly, and perhaps even labeled the shelves with hazards, they are going to be able to move more quickly. They're going to be more aware of what's they need to be most careful around. So I really encourage you to contact the first responders in your area and have a pre-fire plan visit. Any more questions coming in there, Bonnie?
Well, there was an earlier question in storage. Someone asked about in protecting an item from a buffered box, would it be okay to use polyethylene bags for leather, then place it in the box?
The bag is a great way to isolate the leather from the buffered storage container. What I would be a little concerned about is trapping moisture in there with leather. Tissue paper is a breathable material, sheets, tissue paper, things like that. If you have an ideal storage environment, you know the humidity doesn't fluctuate, the temperature doesn't fluctuate, you might be able to get away with the polyethylene sheeting. I would definitely recommend that you constantly are checking in on that, making sure there's no condensation or mold growth. So if there are other materials available, I would recommend those.
She mentioned she's pierced the bag for openings.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a good alternative and way to reduce that too. I would keep an eye on it. That would be my advice. I have a little bit more information. Should I go on, Bonnie? Are we caught up on questions? Okay. I have some information then digging down into more specific types of collections you might find. There's a big concern about topping off solutions, and I won't go too much into this in the interest of time today, but it's something that we can explore in another webinar. If you have a lot of fluid collections or a lot of questions about your fluid collections, the ethanol in these collections evaporates over time, and it's a maintenance problem. Some curators and collections managers will walk through monthly and just top off the ones that are look like the levels are low. That brings up a host of problems. If you're adding whatever percentage of ethanol you're adding, you're changing the concentration in the jar, and there's not total agreement on what that percentage solution should be, but there are suggestions and goals to aim for. So although you're keeping the specimen hydrated and wet, you might be keeping it. If there's too much ethanol, you could be drying out the specimen. If there's too much water, you could be swelling it and distorting it. And again, these are research-based collections. So that's a concern to be careful of with fluid collections. Some people use a grease pencil to mark the line so they can really get a good idea of where the level should be at. If you notice certain specimens are losing levels quickly, you might consider changing the lid or the stopper mechanism. That's where a lot of the loss comes from. And this is a staffing issue. It's something that you could probably train a volunteer or an intern to approach more systematically, and I think that would be a good use of that. A lot of these collections are fixed in formalin, which is formaldehyde and water. Historically, the trend was to leave them in the formalin over time. Just to note that if you're getting rid of the formalin, that's a hazardous waste material, so that's something to consider.
Question here about, what about sealing the lid with paraffin tape?
Paraffin tape is a great material. It's the lab, when you work in a lab, it's something that you'd be familiar with, and that's a great addition with the lid on top of that, or just using that. It is somewhat permeable, and so again, it's just monitoring it. Using the right type of personal protective equipment, solvent-resistant gloves, that's, I'll mention here, but that's the case with everything that you're dealing with. Make sure and read the manufacturer's recommendations for the gloves. They're all designed for different purposes, so you will not have just one pair of gloves in your institution that's good for everything. A few other points about these collections, which applies to many other collections too, is you obviously want to have a rim or some type of rails on your shelf to, in the event of any kind of vibration or earthquake, to keep those in place as much as possible. Not overcrowding the shelves. Again, these collections are so large, and anyone who deals with natural history collections, whether it's ethnographic, ornithology collections, you run out of space eventually. But overcrowding them is very hazardous to the collection. We've been through arsenic and talking about taxidermy mounts. I just wanted to present these slides just so our historic house members know that these things are possibly hazardous and might be in your collections. Again, you need to know if you have this arsenic. There are pretty straightforward arsenic testing kits. If you have a little bit of lab background, don't be afraid of these tests, and if you contact me, I can recommend the test that I use, and it's a simple taking a swab sample off the artifact and then adding the reagents and comparing a test strip. It's a qualitative test, not a quantitative, so you'll know if you have arsenic, and that's really what we're after at this point. That slide just had me thinking about arsenic and old lace, how arsenic is ubiquitous in collections of old material. A quick couple of notes on geology collections. Bones are going to be fairly stable. They've been consolidated in the field perhaps. Keep an eye on them for flaking. If they're really bad, I usually recommend that they be put in a box. This won't stop the flaking, but it will contain the pieces, and if you contact a conservator, they can recommend or treat it for you. Geologist I talked with cautioned on moon rocks. They are a security risk. Their monetary value has skyrocketed, so if you're a small institution that's lucky enough to have one, and people love to see them, so they're often on display, think about security there. And this slide is going to be your friend in caring for natural history collections, and that is because Popeye got his power from spinach, and National Park Service. You'll see my last two resources there. The Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections is also commonly known as spinach. And they just have a wonderful website, lots of information, lots of resources, and people to contact for help. And the National Park Service has a great series of pamphlets called Conservograms that provide a lot of information. I'm going to let Bonnie, okay. I'm just going to say, then I'll say thank you for attending our webinar. Here are some dates for our upcoming webinars, and hope that you will be able to join us for some of those. Thanks for listening today, and don't hesitate to contact me if you have further questions.
Okay, one of these questions is how long these sessions will be archived on the website?
Oh, thanks, Laura. We haven't discussed that, but as far as I know, indefinitely. The Illinois State Museum is serving the website, so I would say indefinitely. Stay tuned.
Well, thank you all again for attending this webinar, and thank you very much, Bronwyn, for the information that you shared with us today. We want to thanks again to Debbie Eggert for the technical assistance, and to the Illinois State Library for hosting today. Again, as we mentioned, this webinar is recorded and will be archived on the ICPN website. We encourage you to visit our website and let us know if you have ideas for future programming. And again,